Hello, my name is Philip Miller, and I have the opportunity today to talk with Robert Indiana, people's painter, a former native son who has come back to Columbus as recently as yesterday to dedicate the work which is currently hanging in the Columbus City Hall. During the dedication yesterday, Mr. Indiana made many references to his background here in Columbus, and today we hope to have an opportunity to talk with him about that and also to trace recent changes and moves he has made in his career. As we discuss these various facts today, we have some various information that we will be sharing with you, and I hope most of all that you will join me in welcoming Robert Indiana to Columbus. Welcome. It's nice to have you back in Columbus.
Well, it's nice to be here, Phil.
Yesterday in the dedication at the City Hall, several of the comments that you made I think were quite interesting, and I think whenever someone has attained the stature certainly that you have on an international level within the art community, one of the things that interests anyone in education, as far as your background goes, is where in your early years did you receive encouragement or really a motivating kind of force that got you started?
Well, I think, interestingly enough, Phil, the very first such encouragement and the very first motivation came really just a few miles from here. And that is, although when I lived in Indiana, it was primarily either in Indianapolis or nearby. There was a year that I spent in Mooresville, and it just so happened that that was the year that John Dillinger had just been killed in Chicago. So the little town of Mooresville that whole year was extremely excited by this development, and of course for a kid of 6 or 7 that was pretty heady stuff. But just by chance, that first year, and the old school still stands, the building that I attended, I had a young teacher. I didn't know it at the time. She told me later that this was her very first year in teaching. And I was in a mixed class where there were both first graders and second graders. And I started drawing in that first year, and I would even do drawings at home and bring them to her the next morning so that she could see them. And she, greatly encouraged me to do this. But the incredible thing that happened was that at the end of that first year, the very last day of school, we had gone down to the chicken hatchery. That was the way of celebrating the last day of school. And we had stopped off at the local drugstore for ice cream cones and so forth. And when we got back to the school, Miss Kaufman, as she was then, she's now Mrs. Ruth Haas in Mooresville, and as far as I know, she's still teaching there. She stopped me and said, "Bobby, I think one day you're going to be a famous artist, and it would make me terribly happy if I could have a couple of your things in my trunk." And so she selected 2 drawings, and I gave them to her, and that was that. Now, I never forgot that. It was always on my mind, but I never, of course, there's so many things that happen in one's life. I'd totally lost track of Miss Kaufman. She had married, changed her name, and there was never any communication between us. But many, many years later, I began to think again about this, and particularly when in Indiana, I knew that people knew that I had become Robert Indiana and so forth. Mm-hmm. And she said that it had crossed her mind. She often wondered if I might be Robert Indiana. But I made an effort to contact her. And on one of my trips back, I went down to Mooresville and had coffee with Mrs. Haas. And in the middle of coffee, she jumped up and went into her bedroom and brought out my 2 drawings, you see. Well, those kind of things have an enormous effect, I think, on a child, and they certainly did me.
Understandably so. I think to anyone who has a chance to look at your work, particularly the auto-portraits and so many of your other works have such deep autobiographical connections with them, you know, certainly to your youth, to the years after you got out of the Air Force and started really working full-time in New York. And I was wondering what experiences from those years, and certainly I know there are numerous ones, but which ones stand out in your mind as being directly affecting your work on kind of an ongoing, continuing basis?
Now, are you speaking of when I was here in Indiana?
Yes.
Well, know that what happened, I was in Mooresville only for that year, and unfortunately, the following schools, I had a mother, and this is the lady whose name began with C, Carmen, and somehow or another she'd been named because it was her father's favorite opera, but she kind of took on gypsy characteristics, and she couldn't bear to live in one house for more than a year at a time, so that by the time I was 17 years old in Indiana, I had lived in 21 different houses. So we were continually on the move. I was continually shifting schools, which really is a very bad thing, I think. And some of those schools, either the art instruction was very, very poor, or in one school, in junior high, there was no art instruction at all. And in fact, it motivated me to leave my mother, with whom I had a greater emotional attachment, and to go and live with my separated and divorced father and his new wife. And that move meant that I would go from a country school to Arsenal Tech in Indianapolis. And of course, at that time, Arsenal Tech was one of the top high schools in the United States. It had an enormous enrollment and a beautiful campus. It was more like going to college. And I'm sure that if television had been extant at that time, why, there would have been classes at Tech in television. It was a vocational as well as an academic school, and they had everything. But at Tech, I got back into art, and they had such an enlightened program that by the time I was a senior at Tech, out of the normal 8 hours of a school day, I had 6 hours of art my last year. And my last year's instructor was a remarkable elderly lady from Philadelphia named Sarah Bard. And she was one of the finest teachers I ever had. I remember her instruction more than I do any of that which I received as a student at the Art Institute in Chicago. And she had an enormous influence on the rest of my life. Now, it was just as in the first grade, when I would go home at night and make drawings to present the next day. At Tech, I would go out on the weekends and paint watercolors of the Indianapolis landscape. And of course, one of the things that I remember most vividly about that is that this was during the war, the Second World War. And I decided that the local gas plant, the gas works, was very picturesque. And so I took my bike and I rode out through this deserted grassland to the gas works and set up my canvas or my drawing board and paper and was busily painting away when all of a sudden I hear these sirens and I look up and there's a procession of about 6 police cars pulling up right next to me. Obviously, some very concerned and patriotic native of Indianapolis had decided that I looked very suspicious there by the side of the chain link fence of the gasworks during the Second World War, and that I might possibly be some sort of nasty saboteur. And the police stopped me, and they immediately sized up the situation, but they decided that I really should finish my watercolor as quickly as possible and move on, you see.
Very interesting. With Indiana obviously playing such an important role in your early years, and also with the taken name of Indiana, I've always wondered, your main activities are really taking you to the East Coast, particularly now to the state of Maine where you live. And with Indiana continuing to play a role in your work, particularly most recently with Columbus and with the Indianapolis work that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, I was curious as to why you've never returned to Indiana full-time to live.
Probably the basic reason, Phil, let's say when I left Indiana, it was to go into the Army. I had received a scholarship from the Scholastic Organization while I was still in high school at Tech to have a one-year scholarship at John Herron. And however, I could read into the future and events well enough to know there was a thing called the GI Bill, which was very soon to expire. And there were foreign events taking place that it seemed that that very instant, 1946, might not be a bad time to forego my one-year scholarship to Herron, get a 5-year scholarship from the U.S. Army, and possibly avoid future wars. And as it turned out, I fit into the service neatly between conflicts, so that I never had to be involved in that sort of thing. And that took me away to Chicago. And in Chicago, after graduating from the Art Institute, I received a fellowship to go to Europe. I used up all my money over there. I had to borrow passage money from the U.S. Embassy to even get back to America. I fell very much in love with England and particularly London, and I would like to have stayed on. So, using up all my money when I got back to America, I didn't have the money to get back home. And it was something like 14 years before I ever scraped together things and managed to get back. It was 6 years in New York before I even had my first show, you see. Things weren't happening quite as rapidly in the art world then as they are now. I don't think it would have taken that long at this point.
Certainly with the recognition that the love image has brought to you with the most popular postage stamp, the commission that you received from the United States government, and from what I understand, it was the most popular postage stamp in the history of the United States.
Except for Christmas stamps.
Christmas stamps. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, and also with the love sculpture, which currently is at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, how did you feel with such an international kind of reaction, such a positive reaction to your love image?
Well, first of all, it was unexpected, Phil. When I did the first Loves, it never occurred to me what would follow. And of course, that was also part of my complications, because I knew nothing about things like copyright and so forth, and it never occurred to me that it was necessary to deal with such matters. And I've suffered a great deal because of that ignorance and because of that inexpertise, shall we say, so that the love has been ripped off in many, many ways, and that's always been very distressing. Now, that it should become probably the most popular and most seen symbol of maybe even this century. There might be competition with Picasso's Peace Dove or something like that, but the postage stamp itself rather cinched the situation with how many copies. There were 333 million love stamps. So that pretty well spread it all across the face of the earth. It was very gratifying. I mean, I'm very fond of my love. I am still doing loves. There's a new portfolio in the Commons right now on exhibit. And the love sculpture in particular will probably go on for the rest of my life. And given the way that certain things can be done even after an artist leaves this world, they might just go on forever, who knows?
Mm-hmm. Part of the program which certainly brought a great deal of attention, I think, to artists in the recent years has been the Art in Public Places movement. And I was wondering, how do you view how art in public places, more interest on the corporate level in collecting and purchasing art, what do you see as this affecting the role between, let's say, the artist and the traditional role of the artist in public?
Well, art in public places, of course, is nothing new, Phil. It's you know, it's being discussed with different nomenclature and so forth, but when I was a kid, and during that very time when I started working myself, the WPA program during the Depression was in full swing, and every post office in the country had a mural, and every railroad station had many murals, and even the new airport terminals had murals.
That was through the WPA
Yeah,
program.
the Works Progress Administration or whatever it was. However, a lot of those things have disappeared. Some were very, very bad. One of the problems with any kind of government patronage of the arts, any problem with business patronage of the arts, is someone has to make the decision as who is selected and what kind of work is selected. And as everybody knows, those in government and those in business are not necessarily trained for that role. If we reach the sophistication where trained and qualified people can play the deciding role, why then we might be on a fairly good track. But we know from the WPA program that absolute disasters can take place with a kind of not very intelligent patronage.
With the dedication of the painting yesterday, and a title that's really attributed to you quite often as a people's painter, or a painter of the people, I was curious too as to what you perceive as a future role that you might pursue along those lines, in terms of what do you see as future directions that you might be
Well, the
heading toward.
surprising thing for me, Phil, and at the same time it makes it very gratifying that it should be in my own last hometown that this public commission should take place. Throughout my whole life, I've only received one other real architectural commission, and that was for the New York World's Fair in 1964 and 65, and that was because the architect of the New York State building at that fair was Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson, I know, has been a visitor to Columbus. None of his buildings have ever been built here, but he was a collector of mine at the time, and so I did the large electric eat sign for his building. That was a peculiar and a particular choice, but I've always felt that my work would lend itself to architecture, and certainly I think my painting for the City Hall works very, very handsomely there. I've always been surprised that I haven't been asked to do more things of this nature, and hopefully maybe this commission will turn myself into that direction. I don't know.
Speaking of the work at the City Hall, how did you go about creating that work? What type of research, what type of preliminary studies did you do in order to come up with a format to use for it?
Well, the most important thing was an actual physical visit here. It had been, I had been back to Columbus several times. I have relatives who live over in Bean Blossom and Elizabethtown and so forth. But I had come back for the dedication of the library and the Pei Library and the Henry Moore sculpture. And so I knew full well what was going on in Columbus, architecturally speaking. But I was brought here to look at the unfinished City Hall, to get an idea of what the building was like. I was given another tour of the city to kind of research, to look for visual things that might be incorporated into the work. Well, that ended up a little frustrated because particularly from the architectural standpoint, the most prominent buildings are really the schools and the churches probably being the most dramatic features on the skyline. Well, for a city government to single out, shall we say, a particular church, obviously that's not a very diplomatic and a proper thing to do. So I had to put that aspect aside, and finally, of course, it devolved into the fact that the letter C was extremely interwoven into the city of Columbus itself and my experiences with the city of Columbus. And so I proceeded from there. But one of the salient aspects of why it is as it is, Phil, is that very early on the mayor expressed a desire. She hoped that my painting might be of such a nature that it could serve as a basis for a new seal for the city of Columbus. Obviously, they're not too happy with their present seal. And since my work by its very nature is almost derived from exactly how a seal does look, that is not where my original inspiration came from, but just by coincidence, many of my paintings have a seal-like look. It was very easy to bring these two things together, and so the painting follows.
I know it was only unveiled yesterday, but to this date, what's your reaction? How do you think the people of Columbus have received your painting?
Well, I saw about 100 fairly happy-looking souls yesterday who were assembled for the ceremony. Every feeling that I've had so far it has been a warm and a responsive one. I haven't seen any scowls, and nobody's asked me any nasty questions, and certainly when Mr. and Mrs. Miller came in for their sneak preview, I had the feeling that they were genuinely pleased with what had transpired. And I've known Mr. and Mrs. Miller for a long time, and they have expressed a desire that Indiana should be in Columbus for many, many years. And so now it's finally happened, and I think it's a felicitous result.
Showing concurrently with the work that's in the City Hall is a show that you brought with you of works that are currently at the Commons Galleries downtown.
Graphics.
Yes, graphics, prints. And I was wondering, many people are curious when an artist is going to show work. How do you go about selecting the pieces that you're going to show in a showing of this sort, where it really is given to you as an opportunity to pick out those items that you would like to be represented by?
Well, in the case of the Commons exhibition, it was very simple, Phil. There's a very definite space limitation there. I've done many prints, and that space would not hold them all. Therefore, it had to be a rather tightly edited show, and I opted for showing mainly my more recent prints. After all, some of my prints had already been seen at the guest center next to the library, and these prints there are two of my in fact, one of the portfolios is not actually finished. Those are trial proofs that are on view. There would be slight color variations before the finished portfolio is released. But the Vinalhaven suite, the 10 years of my life on the island in Maine, that's a very new portfolio. I included the portrait of Picasso because just last month was Picasso's 100th, the anniversary of his birth. I included the Jimmy Carter because I think a portrait of the President of the United States is a rather unique print, and I just wanted the people of Columbus to see it, that's all.
Aside from the autobiographical nature, in many of the works that I've seen both in magazines and in galleries and museums, there is a high degree of social commentary which you include in some of the work, such as, let's say, the Selma, Alabama graphic from a number of years ago.
Part of the Confederacy series, and that was in the 60s at the height of the racial tension, and so I did a series of paintings. Those were paintings, which one became a print, which was a criticism of the South, and I think that they deserved that particular criticism at the time. I think things have changed now.
Yes. Do you see social commentary as being a vital part of your work today, or have you returned more to an autobiographical?
No. I've rather that chapter's rather over with. The presidential portrait, of course, the Jimmy Carter print has a touch of that. I did that because several years ago, at the time when someone named Mr. Rockefeller had aspirations to be president, I did a painting called A Divorced Man Has Never Been the President, you see. And now Mr. Rockefeller took that the wrong way. He actually saw the painting and expressed open criticism of it. I was not criticizing Mr. Rockefeller and the fact that he had been a divorced man. I was criticizing the country for making that kind of a criterion in the first place. Therefore, when I say an honest man has been the president, there is a shade of social commentary there. I mean, it's interesting that a president would run on such a simple concept. I mean, I would presume, we all would presume,
Surely.
the president's going to be an honest man. But
Surely.
we'd had a slightly unfortunate experience before. You see.
Yes. In reading one article about you, there was a comment made by the author of the article that you had commented or stated that when you looked at your current home, which is the Oddfellows Hall that you're redoing, and
The Star of Hope.
Yes, the Star of Hope. That it was very much like an Edward Hopper painting.
It's an Edward Hopper painting. It's an Edward Hopper painting come to life. I mean, there's no question about that.
Yes. Is Edward Hopper a particularly favorite artist of yours?
I would say I'm not very much concerned about Edward Hopper now, but when I was in high school and I was that student of Miss Bard, I have several watercolors that they look like they might have been done by Mr. Hopper. But that is the way a young person learns.
Yes. One of the comments that you had made recently about your move to Maine was the fact that you felt that New York had some inconsistencies, and that there had been some changes, let's say not for the positive, in terms of lines at galleries and the types of groups that were attending many of the openings and shows, and museums were going into real estate. And again, this is attributed to you. But in moving there, what changes have you seen in your work? Or have you seen anything brought about as a result of the geographic change?
Well, no, Phil, that there are lots of things at work here. The principal reason, which you didn't touch upon, about the unattractiveness of New York is simply the economics. I mean, how a young artist can come to New York now and survive or make it is beyond me. When I came there, I found a marvelous studio overlooking the East River in the oldest section of New York for $30 a month, you see. Well, that studio now wouldn't even be $300 a month. It would be more apt to be $600 a month. And my last studio in New York, I had 5 floors, and it was an extremely expensive operation. Maine is a much simpler state, and things are not so high-geared. Now, in the 3 years that I've been there, I'm still unpacking, you see. Every day I find a package and I unwrap it. So the process goes on. I had an enormous amount of material to move. It took 12 trucks or 2 trucks, 12 trips to make the move to Maine. It is only within the last year that I have taken another building, which has become my real studio. I decided that I couldn't actually work in the old Oddfellows Hall. I have a building which is exclusively used for painting. I have a 3rd building, which is an auxiliary studio. So in a sense, I'm just beginning now to get back into production and into gear. And the Columbus painting is my very first major work that I've done since I've been there. Now, I've worked on older paintings and done some minor things, but this is the first one.
In terms of major works, what plans do you have after the...
My plans, I had an interesting thing. My life is filled with coincidences, Phil, but when my movers moved me, and these were local people, local young men, moved me to Maine, they saw that I wasn't going to fit into the building. But I was back in New York busy packing, trying to keep things flowing to move on to the vans. And then on their own initiative, they rented an extra building for me. Well, it turned out later I discovered that extra building was on the very property where where Marsden Hartley, Maine's most famous native painter, had lived when he made his one visit to Vinalhaven in 1938. Now, 1938 is a very significant year for me because that's the year that my grandmother was murdered in South Bend. And that, of course, makes for my link with Congressman Bradamus, who represented that district. But I am intrigued with the work of Marsden Hartley, particularly because his early work deals with words and numbers in a slightly more abstract way than mine. There's as if we were on the very same wavelength. Now, he later came to Maine and decided to become a realist and do the local scene, painting Mount Katahdin and rocks and gulls and pine trees and all that. And he made the statement that if he ever had to paint another pine tree, he'd go out of his mind. I mean, you know. Well, I haven't done my first pine tree, but with that view of the harbor of Vinalhaven that I have from my studio, I would like to perhaps return to realism a little bit myself, as I did with my mother and father painting, and also to make an homage to Marsden Hartley, just as I did to Demuth and his Golden Five, you see.
Mm-hmm. I know that you are planning probably one of the largest commissions of your career, I believe, that's coming up.
Oh, not planning. It's in the works.
It is in the works.
It's been in the works for over a year, and it will extend into 1983, Phil, and that is the realization of my 10 numbers, which have up to this point have always been painted or printed into a sculptural form, three-dimensional.
These are the cardinal numbers, the series.
The 1 through 0, and they are 8 feet high, and they're aluminum, and each number is painted 2 different colors, and hopefully this is a commission from the Melvin Simon organization in Indianapolis. Hopefully one day these 10 numbers will come together and find a permanent home in a reflecting pool on the grounds of the Indianapolis Museum. The Indianapolis Museum has expressed that interest. However, all these things take time and that element called money, and we'll have to see how that works out.
Right. Mm-hmm. Having worked in printmaking, painting, sculpture, I've always wondered, have you ever had a particular project in the back of your mind or something that you wanted to do, just purely from a purely personal nature, that you've never been asked to do or you would like someone to ask you to do?
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I'm on Vinalhaven. Vinalhaven, Phil, is an island about the size of Manhattan. But it doesn't have 8 million people. It has 1,200 people. It is solid granite. And I can swim in the hole that the towers for the Brooklyn Bridge came out of. The columns for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where I used to work, they were hewn on Vinalhaven. So my dream, of course, and it may never be realized, is that on Vinalhaven there will be a love carved from the living rock, you see, just like those guys out on Mount Rushmore. Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, Mr. Indiana, we would like to thank you very much for taking the time to come in and talk with us today, and it sounds like the career is going to carry on in very much the colossal order, certainly if it's going to be made of living stone now, that the other pursuits have followed.
I hope so.
So we look forward to having you back in Columbus, hopefully in the very near future again.
Thank you.
And we would like to thank you very much for joining us today here at the East Television Studio in conversation with Robert Indiana.